What I'm going to talk about comes out of my new project, this political history of slaves that I'm trying to write. But it's not so much about what was happening in slavery, it's about how, it's more of a reflection on how in doing this work and thinking about what slaves knew, when they knew it, how they knew it, and the purposes to what they put all that new knowledge, made me reflect differently on how we write our Reconstruction histories and to think about the ways in which these two histories bump up against each other. For every time we start an investigation into Reconstruction in or after the outbreak of war, we leave the impression that whatever it is that Black people thought, did, or provoked as slaves had little to do with what they managed to make of and for themselves in freedom. Yet perhaps we should make a more concerted effort to reset those mental clocks and to expand our field of vision in order that we may more systematically and carefully include slavery as well as freedom, or slavery in our analyses of freedom. Indeed, I want to suggest that it is risky business to leave slaves as actors out. At the very least, dropping them out or shoving them aside recalls, however unintentionally, an older set of ideas that stridently declared that neither African Americans in general nor the enslaved in particular had a history worth studying. Marginalizing slaves in our freedom stories also raises the distinct possibility that we will miss and consequently misunderstand the full range of forces that shaped the post-Civil War South and by extension the post-Civil War nation. But what I've found is truly rather, I don't know, amusing, more like ironic, I guess would be more appropriate, is that slaveholders knew what many of us still find hard to accept, that the enslaved were a formidable and deeply and well-informed political force. Now, to be sure, most masters and mistresses were pretty coy about admitting too openly that they had a rather big and fierce tiger by its tail. An admission of that nature would have been especially counterproductive in an age of aggressive abolitionism, playing right into the hands of slavery's external enemies. Nevertheless, as I have burrowed deeper and deeper into Planter's records, it's clear that there was no doubt that who slaveholders judged to be their chief opponent. Take, for instance, the increasingly draconian measures enacted by Southern lawmakers in the wake of Vesey's supposed and Turner's actual rebellions. Laws that quarantined Black sailors, evicted slaves from regional print shops, and banned the education of slaves as well as any unsupervised congregations. These were laws that were meant to insulate Black workers not only from outside agitators, but also from one another. Attempts to silence, to isolate, to put these people in little quiet boxes. Just as suggestive is the language slaveholders used to describe the slaves who gave them the most grief. Abjuring the dismissive and dehumanizing idioms of childhood or livestock, aggrieved planters routinely decried their more troublesome property in words normally reserved for political opponents, berating those who frightened them most as secret agents, traitors, subversives, saboteurs, rebels, representatives, and ringleaders. And it was not necessarily by chance that Mary Chesnut mockingly likened her husband's valet to a famous, if fictional, international spy. Lawrence, Chesnut wrote of the man in her diary, was a, quote, copper-colored Count Fosco among us. She read European literature. William Capers, who toward the end of the 1850s was an overseer for the Manigault family on one of the Savannah River plantations, just as emphatically underscored the political potential of the slaves when he announced rather bitterly about those under his when he announced rather bitterly that those under his supervision were nothing but, quote, a set of tackies, language that linked those the Teamsters, who he found especially problematic, to the 18th century Jamaican, who has been credited by a number of scholars for launching an age of Atlantic rebellion, drawing these lines between this property and slaves and very powerful political actors. But it was a Georgia planter, Richard Lyon, who may have made the point best. Slaves, he grumbled in a letter to the governor, were a fully realized political people, individuals who not only possessed their own well-developed ideas, aspirations, and ambitions, but who also enjoyed the institutional, intellectual, and collective means to achieve them. To ignore that reality was simply suicidal, Lyon explained in a sharply worded response to a military call for laborers to build Savannah's early wartime defenses. Assembled by necessity from across the state and formed into large crews of erstwhile strangers, such congregations, Lyons cried, would afford the state's opportunities, quote, an opportunity to talk to one another of their wants and their wishes and their situations.